Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The First Class Dream. Marcus Johnson adjusted the tie on his son Timothy, giving it one last tug to make sure it was perfectly straight. They stood in the priority boarding line, their first-class tickets in hand, as they waited for their turn to board. It wasn't just a flight, it was a symbol of everything they had worked for. Marcus could almost feel the weight of that ticket in his hand, a tangible reminder of the long, grueling hours spent building their consulting business from the ground up. There had been sacrifices, setbacks, and plenty of sleepless nights, but it had all been worth it. Timothy, barely 7, bounced on his toes in excitement. His eyes were wide as he peered through the large terminal windows, watching the massive aircraft parked on the tarmac. To him, this was like stepping into a whole new world, a world his parents had worked hard to give him. "Remember what we practiced, little man," Marcus said, his voice calm and reassuring. His fingers lightly brushed against Timothy's shirt, smoothing out the wrinkles. "Yes, Dad," Timothy said, his face lighting up with a smile. "Sit up straight, use the right fork, and always say please and thank you." "That's right," Diana, Marcus's wife, added, giving Marcus a proud glance. She squeezed his hand, the glint of her designer watch catching the light as they stood together, a family ready to embark on an adventure. Diana's carry-on bag rested at her feet, an indulgent splurge for this trip, a sign of their success. The past 15 years had been a blur of long days, strategy sessions, and client meetings. They'd poured everything into their business, and now, finally, they had reached a point where they could afford luxuries like this, first-class tickets to Paris, a trip they had dreamed about since their early days in business. It wasn't just a vacation. It was a celebration. A moment to show Timothy the world from a perspective they never had growing up. A chance to make memories, to live their dream, and to pass on the value of hard work and perseverance. As the gate agent called for first-class boarding, Marcus's heart swelled with pride. This was their moment. Together, they stepped forward with practiced confidence. Timothy tugged at his father's hand, his excitement infectious as they made their way toward the jet bridge. "Do you think the seats really turn into beds?" Timothy asked, his voice full of wonder as they walked. "Better than that," Marcus said, grinning. "They turn into your own private little world, with headphones, blankets, and everything." "And the fancy headphones you told me about?" Timothy asked again, his eyes sparkling. "Of course," Marcus said, guiding him forward, the weight of their shared anticipation filling the air. It was moments like these that made every sacrifice worthwhile. They boarded the aircraft and were greeted by the gleaming interior of the first-class cabin. The seats were upholstered in soft leather, the wood accents gleaming with a rich, polished glow. Marcus could feel his pulse quicken as they walked toward their row 2. It was exactly what they had dreamed of, luxury, comfort, and the feeling that they had arrived. Timothy, who had been so eager to see the plane's interior, immediately rushed to the window seat he had requested when booking the flight. His tiny hands pressed against the cold window, and his face lit up as he watched the ground crew loading bags and preparing the plane for takeoff. Marcus helped his son settle into the seat, adjusting the footrest and fiddling with the entertainment system, making sure everything was just right. But as Marcus scanned the cabin, something felt off. There was a subtle undercurrent of tension. A few passengers were glancing in their direction, some doing double takes as they passed, their eyes lingering a bit too long. A woman in a chic black dress clutched her designer handbag closer to her chest as the Johnsons made their way down the aisle. A businessman, who had been checking his ticket, briefly looked from the paper to them and then back to his ticket again, as though he wasn't sure if he was in the right place. Diana noticed it too, but she chose not to acknowledge it. She focused instead on Timothy, who was now excitedly exploring the seat controls, pushing buttons, and laughing as the footrest extended. Diana smiled, trying to block out the mounting discomfort that seemed to permeate the space. She had dressed carefully for the flight, choosing a tailored blazer and minimal makeup, wanting to look elegant but not too flashy. Yet now, she questioned why she had felt the need to prove anything to anyone. The whole purpose of this trip was for their family to enjoy something they had worked so hard to achieve, but it felt like the weight of judgment was following them in the form of sidelong glances and hushed whispers. "Is everything okay?" Diana asked, breaking the silence. She had noticed the flight attendant, a woman named Sarah, approaching their row with an expression that didn't match her professional smile. Sarah, who had been scanning the cabin to check passengers' boarding passes, paused in front of their seats, her smile stiffening slightly. "Good evening," she said, her voice dropping a notch in volume. "Would you mind if I verified your boarding passes?" Marcus, who had been mentally prepared for this moment, remained calm. He had been through situations like this before, subtle hints of doubt that people like him didn't belong in spaces reserved for the elite, but he wasn't going to let it rattle him now. He had worked too hard to get here. "Of course," Marcus said, his voice steady, reaching into his jacket pocket for their tickets. He handed them to Sarah with deliberate slowness, his eyes meeting hers. "But I believe the gate agent already verified them." Sarah glanced down at the tickets, her eyes scanning over the names with what felt like unnecessary scrutiny. She checked the boarding passes several times, before glancing up at Marcus and then at Diana. Her gaze darted between the documents and their faces, as if searching for some kind of mistake. "I'm just ensuring everyone is in their correct seats," Sarah explained, though the discomfort in her voice was hard to miss. "We've had some confusion with seating assignments lately." The tension in the air was palpable. The passengers around them, who had previously been minding their own business, now seemed to be pretending not to watch. A couple across the aisle exchanged whispered words, their eyes darting toward the Johnson family. It was clear they were all waiting for something. Diana raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, her tone becoming firm. "Are there any other issues?" she asked, her voice carrying a quiet challenge. Sarah hesitated, a thin smile returning to her lips. "No, everything seems to be in order." "Just a small precaution," she said, handing back their boarding passes. But the damage had already been done. The uncomfortable silence hung heavy in the air, as though the flight attendants and the other passengers were all waiting for the Johnson family to make a move, to show that they belonged. Diana glanced over at Marcus. She could see the anger simmering behind his calm expression. This was not the first time they had encountered such treatment, but it never got easier. Each time it happened, it stung just as much as the last. Timothy, however, was oblivious to the subtle discrimination that had just unfolded. He was too busy adjusting his seat controls, still thrilled by the novelty of first class. He kicked his feet up in the footrest, eyes wide with wonder. Diana smiled at him, determined not to let this moment be ruined by anyone else's prejudice. But as the plane began to fill up and the whispers continued, Marcus knew one thing for certain: they were about to face more than just an uncomfortable flight. What began as an evening of celebration was quickly shaping up to be a test of character, one that would challenge not only their dignity but their resolve. And as the tension in the cabin grew, a figure standing at the back of the plane noticed something wasn't quite right. The unlikely ally. As the plane continued to fill with passengers, the sense of unease that had settled over the Johnson family only grew heavier. The whispers, the sideways glances, and the lingering stares didn't stop. Diana could feel the eyes on them, and although she tried to brush it off, a part of her couldn't ignore the quiet but insistent voice in her head that asked, "Do we belong here?" Timothy, blissfully unaware of the discomfort his parents were experiencing, continued to fiddle with the seat controls, grinning with joy as he explored the high-tech amenities of first class. "Look, Mom, it even has a massage feature," he exclaimed, pushing a button and laughing as the seat adjusted beneath him. Diana chuckled softly, appreciating her son's ability to remain joyful, despite the palpable tension. "You're going to be so spoiled after this flight," she teased, her voice light. But even as she smiled at Timothy's innocence, the nagging feeling that they didn't quite fit in lingered, gnawing at her. She glanced over at Marcus, who had slipped into a quiet contemplation, his gaze fixed ahead, trying to avoid meeting anyone's eye. It was then that the flight attendants began their usual pre-flight routine. There were the familiar safety announcements, the instructions about seat belts, and the reminders to stow carry-on luggage. But amidst all the typical announcements, there was something unsettling about the way Sarah and the other flight attendants moved around the cabin, avoiding the Johnson family's row, deliberately leaving them in the corner of their eye. It wasn't just the questioning that bothered Marcus, it was the fact that no one had stepped in to correct the situation. No one had spoken up, no one had said, "This is wrong." As the plane finally began to taxi down the runway, Marcus tried to focus on the excitement of the trip ahead. The hum of the engines, the gentle sway of the plane as it gained altitude, should have been comforting. And yet, with every passing minute, the sense of isolation seemed to grow. That's when it happened. A soft voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, is everything all right here?" Marcus, startled by the sudden interruption, turned to find the source of the voice. At first, he thought it was another flight attendant, but to his surprise, it was a man, a tall, well-dressed individual in his mid-40s, wearing a navy blue suit with a captain's insignia on his shoulder. His dark hair was neatly combed, his posture straight. The man wasn't wearing a uniform in the traditional sense, but his presence was unmistakable. He had the confident air of someone who belonged in a leadership role. There was no mistaking the calm authority he exuded. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the man said again, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "But I overheard a conversation earlier, and I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. Is there a problem with the seating arrangements?" Marcus stared at him for a moment, confused. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. Was this another flight attendant? Someone else in charge? Or was this something else entirely? Diana, noticing the man's appearance, quickly sized him up. There was something about the way he spoke, calm, respectful, that made her feel, for the first time since boarding, a glimmer of hope. Could this be the person who would step in and correct the situation? Could he help them navigate the silent, unspoken tension that had been building since they boarded? The man's eyes flicked to Sarah, who was standing nearby, her posture tense. "Is everything okay?" he asked her directly, his tone gentle but firm. Sarah hesitated for a split second, her eyes darting from the man to the Johnson family. She opened her mouth, as if to respond, but closed it just as quickly, her fingers tightening around the paperwork she held. The man didn't wait for her response. Instead, he looked back at Marcus and Diana, his gaze steady. "My name is Captain John Hayes. I'm an off-duty pilot," he said, offering a small but warm smile. "I couldn't help but notice that there seems to be some confusion here. I want to make sure everything is taken care of before we get started." The mention of his title caught Marcus off guard. The man was an off-duty pilot, not just any random passenger. And he was stepping in, offering his help, in a way that no one else had so far. "We're fine," Marcus replied carefully, his voice still polite but guarded. He didn't want to cause any trouble, not on this special trip. "We were just double-checked by the flight attendant. Everything seems to be in order." John nodded slowly, taking a step closer. "I understand. But as someone who's spent a lot of time in the air, I know the importance of feeling comfortable and respected during a flight." His eyes lingered for a moment on the Johnson family before he added, "And if there's any reason why you're not being made to feel that way, then that's something I need to address. We're all passengers here, and we all deserve the same courtesy, no matter our background." Diana blinked in surprise. No one had ever spoken so openly about the situation, let alone acknowledged the unspoken tension that had been brewing. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She had grown used to the microaggressions, the subtle digs, the quiet assumptions about her and her family. But this man, this off-duty pilot, was different. He wasn't asking questions, wasn't trying to dance around the issue. He was simply stating the truth. "I'm just making sure that everything is in order," Captain Hayes continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's, who was now visibly uncomfortable. "If you need any assistance, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm happy to help." The flight attendant finally cleared her throat and shifted her weight uncomfortably. "Everything's fine, Captain," she said, her voice lacking its earlier firmness. "I was just making sure all passengers are in their correct seats." John's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in a quiet, resolute understanding. "I'm sure everything is in order," he said gently, but his tone was firm enough to leave no room for doubt. "But I want to make sure that if there's an issue, it's resolved the right way. This is a first-class cabin, and everyone here has earned their seat." He turned his attention back to Marcus and Diana, offering them a warm smile that was free from the pretense that had marked so many of their interactions that day. "I'm sure you've worked hard for this moment. I just want to make sure you enjoy it without feeling like you have to prove something to anyone. You deserve this. All of us do." For a brief, fleeting moment, Diana felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't the grand gesture she'd always hoped for, but it was a validation, a quiet acknowledgement that they weren't alone in this moment. They weren't fighting an invisible battle. Someone else had seen it, someone else had recognized it. Marcus exhaled slowly, his posture relaxing. He gave a subtle nod, thankful for the captain's intervention, but not wanting to draw more attention to the situation than necessary. "Thank you, Captain," he said, his voice sincere. "It means a lot to us." With one last nod, Captain Hayes turned to walk down the aisle, his presence commanding yet respectful. He wasn't looking for recognition, nor was he seeking applause. He had simply done what was right, and in doing so, he had given the Johnson family something they hadn't had in years, a moment of peace. As the captain disappeared into the cabin, Diana squeezed Marcus's hand. "Maybe this trip will turn out to be more than just a vacation," she murmured. Marcus smiled, his eyes fixed on the back of the cabin where Captain Hayes had just walked. "It already has," he said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. And with that, the plane's engines roared louder, as if in solidarity with the small but significant change in the atmosphere. The Johnsons weren't alone anymore. The rising tide. As the plane ascended into the clouds, the initial unease that had marked the beginning of the flight began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative sense of calm. The hum of the engines, the soft swaying of the aircraft, and the muffled voices of fellow passengers blended into a comforting lull. The clouds outside stretched like a vast, ever-changing ocean, their shadows casting fleeting patterns on the wing. Despite the stillness, something was shifting in the air. The atmosphere had changed. And for the Johnson family, the shift felt significant. Timothy, ever the optimist, continued to explore the wonders of first class. He had now discovered the seat's reclining feature, and with a delighted squeal, he pushed a button that adjusted his seat to a near-horizontal position, much to his parents' amusement. Diana, her mind still processing the conversation with Captain Hayes, leaned back in her own seat, watching her son's antics with a soft smile. The man's intervention had been unexpected, but in that moment, Diana couldn't help but feel grateful. Not just for the captain's help, but for the fact that, perhaps, the world wasn't entirely as cold and judgmental as it had sometimes seemed. Still, despite the kindness shown by Captain Hayes, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that lingered just beneath the surface. There was something unsettling about how the rest of the cabin had reacted, about how everyone had watched, scrutinized, and whispered in hushed tones. It wasn't just the flight attendant, Sarah's, behavior, it was the passengers, the subtle, almost imperceptible ways they had questioned their right to be there. As the flight continued, Marcus glanced around the cabin. People were still glancing his way, not as openly as before, but there were still whispers, furtive looks that didn't sit right. They were quieter now, but they were still there. Diana noticed it too, but she was careful not to let it show. She had spent years learning to read these unspoken cues, years of navigating spaces where she didn't quite feel like she belonged. The wealthy, the privileged, the well-dressed, sometimes, it felt like there were invisible barriers that kept them at arm's length. But Timothy was oblivious. To him, this was magic. It was all magic. He had never seen anything like the flight attendants' uniforms, the shiny silver trays with glasses of freshly squeezed orange juice, the warm towels that had been handed out moments after takeoff. Everything was new, everything was a wonder. His excitement was contagious, and for a moment, Marcus allowed himself to be swept up in it, letting go of the tension that had built since boarding. The food service began shortly after takeoff, and Marcus found himself sinking into the luxurious experience. The meal was exquisite, an appetizer of smoked salmon and caviar, followed by a main course of seared duck breast with a rich, decadent sauce. Timothy was so entranced by the taste of his chicken fingers and mashed potatoes that he barely noticed the wine being poured into Marcus's glass. It was during the meal that the unspoken tension in the cabin resurfaced in an unexpected way. A group of passengers seated nearby, a well-dressed couple, had been watching the Johnsons for most of the flight. Diana had noticed them earlier, exchanging glances with each other, then turning their eyes toward the family as if trying to puzzle something out. They were close enough for Diana to hear their murmurs, though they spoke just above a whisper. "Do you think they're really supposed to be in first class?" the woman asked, her voice low but still audible. "I don't know," the man replied, his tone equally cautious. "Maybe they're frequent flyers, but I just find it odd. They don't exactly look the part." Diana stiffened. Her grip on the edge of the table tightened. She knew exactly what they meant by not exactly looking the part. She had heard those words before, though they were never spoken aloud. The part meant wealthy, it meant sophisticated, it meant a certain image that people like the Johnsons didn't always fit, at least in the eyes of some. But hearing it, now, spoken in front of her, was a gut punch. She looked at Marcus, whose jaw was clenched, his eyes narrowed. His focus was no longer on the meal before him but on the couple across the aisle. Diana could feel the simmering anger within him, the frustration of yet another microaggression, another moment where they were forced to prove their worth. She reached out and touched his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Don't let them get to you," she whispered softly. Marcus took a slow breath, his hand relaxing beneath hers. "I won't. But it's hard to ignore it when it's right in front of you." The comments didn't go unnoticed by the flight attendants either. Sarah, who had been making her rounds, had overheard the exchange. For a moment, she hesitated, looking at the Johnson family and then at the couple. There was a brief, almost imperceptible shift in her demeanor. She glanced once more at Captain Hayes, who was sitting further down the aisle, lost in a book. It was clear she was unsure what to do. But before she could act, the couple across the aisle spoke up once more, their voices dripping with condescension. "Excuse me," the woman said loudly, as if trying to draw attention to herself, "but we've been waiting for over 10 minutes. Could we get some service over here?" Sarah, who had been standing a few feet away, immediately turned her attention to the couple, but not before glancing at the Johnsons. There was a moment of hesitation in the air, a breath held, as if something was about to shift. That's when Captain Hayes, who had been observing the entire exchange from the corner of his eye, rose from his seat and made his way over. His presence seemed to command immediate attention. "Is everything all right here?" Captain Hayes asked, his voice calm but authoritative. The couple looked at him, startled. They clearly hadn't expected him to intervene. The woman's lips parted, as though she was about to speak, but the captain didn't wait for her response. Instead, he turned to the flight attendant, Sarah, who had been standing nearby. "Sarah, could you please attend to this family's needs first?" he asked, his tone polite but unwavering. "I believe they've been waiting for assistance." Sarah, taken aback by the captain's directness, blinked in surprise but quickly nodded. "Of course, Captain. I'll take care of them right away." The woman across the aisle opened her mouth to protest, but the captain's gaze was steady, unyielding. "I'm sure you'll be taken care of shortly," he said, his voice now carrying an edge of finality. "Let's be respectful of all passengers on this flight." The couple fell silent. They didn't speak another word during the rest of the meal, their faces flushed with embarrassment, their whispers dying down. For a brief, fleeting moment, Marcus felt a small victory. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a necessary one. The subtle prejudices that had been allowed to fester were being addressed, quietly but firmly, by someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. Diana looked at Marcus, her eyes wide. "I didn't expect that," she said, her voice soft with surprise and relief. Marcus smiled, though it was tinged with exhaustion. Neither did I. Captain Hayes returned to his seat, his job done, but his influence lingering in the air. The cabin, once thick with unspoken judgments, seemed to exhale collectively. The flight continued, but it was different now. The unease that had clouded the Johnsons' experience had lifted, and for the first time that evening, Marcus allowed himself to relax, to breathe. As the hours passed and the plane continued its journey toward Paris, Marcus and Diana shared a quiet conversation. Timothy had fallen asleep, his head resting against his mother's shoulder, his small hand clutching her arm as he dreamed of adventure. "You know," Marcus said softly, his eyes on their son, "this is why we work so hard. For moments like this." Diana nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "We've come so far." And as the plane soared higher, carrying them toward new horizons, they both knew that this trip would be more than just a vacation. It would be a reminder that, no matter how far they had come, there was still work to be done, work to change the world, one small but meaningful act of kindness at a time. A new beginning. As the plane began its descent toward Paris, the golden hue of sunset filtered through the cabin windows, casting a soft, amber light across the faces of the passengers. The tension that had once gripped the Johnson family had eased into something far gentler, and the journey, though far from flawless, had become one of quiet triumph. Timothy stirred in his seat, stretching his limbs as he slowly woke from his nap. His eyes fluttered open, and the first thing he saw was the gleaming skyline of Paris spread out before them through the small window. His excitement bubbled up once more, and he sat up straight, his eyes wide with wonder. "Are we almost there?" he asked, his voice a mix of anticipation and awe. Marcus smiled, leaning over to ruffle his son's hair. "We sure are, buddy. This is going to be one incredible adventure." Diana's hand rested on Marcus's knee, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come, both literally and metaphorically. Just a few days ago, they were a family struggling to break through barriers, fighting against a world that sometimes felt like it didn't want to see them in places of success. Now, they were sitting in first class, a dream they had worked toward for years, and though the road had been filled with its share of challenges, they had made it. But as much as this trip was about celebrating their hard work, it had become something more profound. It had become a testament to their resilience and to the unexpected acts of kindness that had altered the course of their journey. From the quiet support of Captain Hayes to the realization that sometimes, the best way to fight back against prejudice was not with confrontation, but with grace and dignity. That subtle lesson would stay with them long after the last course of their in-flight meal had been served. The flight attendants were now securing the cabin for landing, and Diana caught Sarah's eye as she walked down the aisle, offering her a polite but reserved smile. The flight attendant didn't immediately return the smile, but there was something different about her demeanor. It was as though the events of the past few hours had caused her to reflect on her own actions, and she now carried herself with a more mindful air, as if having realized that there were things far bigger than the rules she had been following. Diana thought about the conversation she'd overheard earlier, about the couple's dismissive remarks. But instead of allowing it to sour her mood, she turned her focus toward the changes that had taken place since then. There was no sweeping gesture, no public applause, but there had been a shift, a quiet shift that began with a simple act of speaking up. She had always believed that change started with individuals taking responsibility, even in the smallest of moments. And Captain Hayes had done just that, showing them that no matter how much time had passed or how ingrained prejudice might seem, it could still be confronted, calmly, gracefully, and with the force of quiet but unshakable conviction. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, the familiar rumble of wheels meeting the runway jolted them all from their thoughts. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, the announcement as professional and calm as ever, yet somehow more welcoming now. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport. We hope you enjoyed your flight with us today. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for choosing to fly with us. We wish you a wonderful stay in Paris." The cabin erupted into polite applause, and for a moment, it felt as though the world itself was giving a collective nod of approval. But even as the applause faded and the passengers began to gather their belongings, Diana felt the weight of the past few hours lift from her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly seen, not as an outsider, not as someone who had to fight to belong, but as a person who was worthy of respect, as much as anyone else on this plane. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As they deplaned and made their way through the airport, the Johnson family walked through the terminal hand in hand, their steps lighter, their spirits higher than they had been when they first boarded the flight in New York. Paris lay ahead, a city that held the promise of new beginnings, new adventures, and new perspectives. It was a place where they could finally step outside the shadow of the past and embrace the future they had worked so hard to build. The terminal buzzed with energy, travelers hurrying toward their gates, families reuniting with loved ones, the sense of possibility in the air as everyone prepared to take their next steps in the world. It was a feeling that resonated with Marcus and Diana, as though the very air of Paris was filled with the energy of a fresh start, of the unknown, of potential. As they passed through customs and stepped into the arrivals hall, Diana paused for a moment, taking in the scene around them. She had always dreamed of seeing the world, of experiencing its beauty and its complexities. But now, standing there in the heart of one of the most iconic cities in the world, she realized that it wasn't just the places they visited that mattered, it was how they navigated the journey, how they chose to respond to the challenges along the way. "Are you ready for Paris, kiddo?" Marcus asked, his voice full of warmth and excitement. Timothy looked up at them, his eyes sparkling with the same curiosity and wonder he had shown since boarding the plane. "I can't wait to see everything," he exclaimed, his voice bubbling with the enthusiasm that only a child could have. "I want to see the Eiffel Tower. And eat all the croissants." Marcus chuckled, leaning down to ruffle his son's hair once more. "I think we can make that happen, little man." Diana watched them, her heart swelling with pride and love. They had worked so hard for this moment, for this trip, for this opportunity to show their son the world. And now that they were finally here, in a place that felt as full of history as it did of possibility, she couldn't help but feel that their journey was just beginning. As they exited the airport and stepped into the cool Parisian air, Diana breathed deeply, taking in the unfamiliar scents and sounds. It was a moment of profound clarity. They had arrived. But this wasn't just about Paris, it was about everything that had brought them here. It was about their struggles, their perseverance, their moments of doubt, and their quiet victories. The family's journey had been far from easy, but each obstacle, each challenge, had shaped them into who they were. The moments of uncertainty, the whispers, the stares, and even the awkward silences, all of it had led them here. To Paris. To this moment of success, of quiet victory. And as they stood together, looking out at the sprawling city before them, Marcus, Diana, and Timothy knew that they were ready for whatever came next. Together, they were unstoppable. The adventure, it seemed, had only just begun.